biggest problem for me is which ones, all right, because Lent is even worse than Advent for me. Advent's got a lot of books I could suggest, but Lent, it's impossible. There's bookcases, literally, of wonderful titles to read. So what I did was, to make life easier for me, was I just picked the 3 or 4 that I would use this Lent and that I've used consistently for the past couple of years. They're my favorites. The first one I want to suggest to you is the Gospel. And it might sound like an obvious book to use, but the problem I run into when here it is, I don't want to show you the back of the book. It's called The Gospels for Prayer, which is exactly what you would use this book for. It's not reading the Gospel, it's not sitting down to do spiritual reading or to do a Bible study. It's actually using the Gospel itself for prayer. And it's the best thing you could use. All the other books will tell you things about the gospel. Why not go to the actual source? The thing I like about this book is, though, the way it's set up. And if you, I have a habit of writing down my favorite quotes from the gospel, putting them in a little separate notebook so that I can easily reflect on them, because those are the quotes that speak to my heart. So the same thing when you use the gospel for prayer, instead of sitting down with your Bible, I've done this, so I know. You start to read your little passage, and then you end up reading pages, because it's, I don't know about you, but I when it comes to books, I gobble, okay? And even when it comes to the gospel, I start with my little passage, but then curiosity gets me reading more than I want. And so it ends up becoming spiritual reading rather than meditation or a contemplative type of reflection on the gospel. But this book was set up precisely to be used as a prayer book, praying the gospels. So it's in, it goes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but what he does is each little piece that you would use of the gospel is on its own page. So and there's lots of space around it so you don't get distracted. And when it comes to just sitting down to read a Bible with footnotes and commentary, it's a minefield for distraction. Another beautiful feature in this book, I think it's worth the price of the book itself, is in the beginning it has 10 different prayer methods. I'll just read through some of them for you. It has the explanation of it on the description of the prayer method on one side, and the outline, the how-to, on the other side, which instead of each of these prayer methods could take a book in itself to explain. So what the author does is he puts it in a nutshell, which for busy people is really, really good. It's also good for me. Find books it's called The Strangest Way by Father Barron. When I finished this book, I actually looked for Father Barron's email address to thank him for writing this book. I said, I've never done this with a book, or went in search of the author. I said, but I really have to thank you for writing this book. It was so good. Most books, and because there's so many books and there's so little time, I generally only read the book once. But this book I think I read 2 or 3 times consecutively, because the first time around wasn't enough. It feels like you need to read it again to really get everything out of it. If you're going to make a retreat, if you want to do a little bit of extra reading, and this is reading, not just meditating the Gospels, but actual reading for Lent, this is perfect. The Strangest Way. And I suggest this book also because there's so many books. You know how they say you can't judge a book by its cover? I do. You do. Everybody does. But working in a bookstore, when I see a book that looks boring, sorry, Father Barron, but the choice of Chagall for the front cover I would have picked something else. But I picked it up and I said, who's going to buy this book? How am I going to suggest it? It says The Strangest Way. What is it about? Actually, it's about Christianity and how Christianity is the strangest way, but it's also one of the most exciting ways. And Father Barron, so he has 3 different ways, 3 different paths. He said the Christian way consists of this: finding the center, knowing you are a sinner, and realizing your life is not about you. And that sounds very simplistic, but boy, is there a lot to it. And he explains it in I found it fascinating, because he introduced me to literature that I wasn't, I hadn't read myself, but after I read his book, I went out and got him. The first path, he said, he gives literary examples of the paths. And the first one was from Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, which is a marvelous book. The second was from Dante's Purgatorio. And the third was from Flannery O'Connor's The Violent Bear It Away. And then at the end of each path, he also gives concrete practices that you know, like, that's great, that's wonderful, the theory is beautiful, so how do I live it? And he actually gives you the examples of how to. But I think what I really enjoyed about it is that he took literature, he took art, he took architecture, all kinds of things that, you know, we're exposed to, and he showed how it illustrates these different paths. So I think it's a nice introduction to these classics, and it's a book I think you will definitely reread many times. But Lent is a really great time to start. And I was requested to suggest short books because some of the books I read are a little bit, you know, more reading to it. But for busy people, and I use this too, it's Ignatius Press put out a lovely series of classics, and it's called Sermon in a Sentence. And the one that is my favorite is the one by Francis DeSales. They also put together ones of Catherine of Siena, Therese of Lisieux, and Teresa of Avila. And the way the book is set up is by the mysteries of the Rosary. Each mystery has a different virtue, and under those they take selected thoughts from the writings of that particular saint. So from Francis DeSales, they took from his book Treatise on the Love of God, from his personal letters, and from Introduction to the Devout Life. All of them classics, which I have to admit I haven't read, but I tend to read things in a nutshell too. So reading things like this often leads me to pick up the book itself, and I just started Introduction to the Devout Life, which is a timeless classic. But if you want a good introduction to it, this is a great book to start. And this, you can see from this how short they are. This is the first joyful mystery, and the virtue is humility, and there may be 2 lines, 1 or 2 sentences each. So they are very nice to use when you're saying the rosary, or if you're traveling. The size is also nice. It's also good for meditation reflections, for prayer starters. Sometimes, instead of reading pages of a book, 2 lines are sufficient, especially when it's the best part. Worry disturbs reason and good judgment and prevents us from doing well the very things we are worried about. So these are not just spiritual but practical suggestions. Perfect love implies absolute trust in the person loved. So if you want something short, something portable, something you can take with you, but definitely packed, really packed full of beautiful inspiration. And it's also a companion rosary meditation book. I would suggest there are also 3 others in the series if you like other saints better, but Francis DeSales, I would highly suggest this one. One is a little bit more reading and a little bit, I won't say difficult to get through, but it's not an easy read, but it's one of the most inspiring books that I've read. This is a book I read every year, and I read it for Holy Week. I start it like the Tuesday or Wednesday of Holy Week, and it goes all the way through. How can I describe it? Von Balthasar, after I read this, I went to look for some of his other books, and some of his other books are way more than I can handle. He's a marvelous author, a great theologian, but this, I think, would be the most accessible of all his books, the most heartfelt, definitely. And in a way, I guess it's kind of like the Imitation of Christ in the way it's set up. The chapters are much longer, so it's not those short chapters that Thomas à Kempis has, but it's that dialogue style with Jesus. So there's definitely parts of it that it's Jesus speaking to the soul, and other times when it's the soul reflecting and speaking to Jesus. But it is the most perfect book for Holy Week. It goes all through the passion of Jesus and the resurrection and the agony and the Last Supper. It's really beautiful, but it's very reflective. Something, again, that you could read this every single year and still find something else in it that you could get out of. I suggested Read of God for Advent. This is the one that I read every year for Holy Week. So anybody that wants a little bit more in-depth reading, this one, please start with this one. There's always more books, and if I could, I would have brought the stack that I really, was going to suggest, but time is limited. So that being the case, this is the one I would suggest for Holy Week.